Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another Warhammer Lore video. Today we'll be looking a bit at Regiments of Renown, or Dogs of War as they are often called. These are more or less famous formations of mercenary warbands that roam the Warhammer world. Of course, in addition to these warbands are less reputable groups. For example, random groups of pikemen or crossbowmen that hire their services out to the various lords and ladies in Tilea. But we will concentrate mostly on the big ones. But first of all, what exactly is a mercenary company in the Warhammer world? Well, much like in our own world, these companies are usually represented by a single man or a conclave of men that represent the interests of a larger body of soldiers for hire. In most cases, these bands are motivated by monetary gains. They are usually paid a rather extraordinary amount of coin for their services, although some mercenary warbands might have other preferences for their, mode of payment. For example, Lumpin Crook and his Fighting Cooks, a halfling warband, tend to ask only for a small monetary contribution as long as their food costs are covered. That might sound nice and cheap to begin with, until you realize just how much and just how expensive ingredients halflings are capable of devouring, and in very, very considerable quantities. If the halflings were even half as good at making the enemy disappear as they were at making rations vanish, they would be the fiercest fighters in the Warhammer world. And speaking of halflings, Regiments of Renown are a remarkably diverse lot. You have everything from northern barbarians to hairy-toed savages to noble high elves and down-on-their-luck princes. The life of a mercenary is often a somewhat violent, turbulent, and occasionally deadly profession. However, it does pay remarkably well, and as any good mercenary captain will tell you, it tends to pay even better when you switch sides. Something that most mercenary bands will have very, very few scruples about doing as often as possible. You could quite easily consider a mercenary's wet dream scenario to be one in which he marches upon an enemy city and is then paid to march back again for all eternity, without ever fighting a single solitary battle. In fact, it could quite easily be said that a mercenary captain's primary responsibility is to avoid battle at absolutely any cost whatsoever. And while there certainly are mercenary bands out there that are motivated by things a bit more spiritual, perhaps, or a little bit more charitable than just good old-fashioned bulging sacks of copper coins, these are rather few and far between, and as such you can imagine that the mercenary companies of the old world often acquire a bit of a reputation, perhaps for somewhat disloyal service, or simply just being somewhat lacking in enthusiasm when presented with the enemy. All relatively standard mercenary fare, to the point where many nations have acquired certain traditions, shall we say, on how to deal with them. For example, the Empire will frequently utilize mercenary warbands as a small part of their total army, usually placing them in a position where running away is not much of an option, and then surrounding them by more steadfast troops to encourage them to keep to the letter of their contract rather than the spirit of said contract. In the lands of Tilea, however, entire armies of mercenaries are frequently levied. In fact, the only real standing army that most Tilean city-states could ever be said to have would be the City Watch, which, more than anything, is essentially a policing force. However, the mercenaries have a rather pragmatic view on the situation in Telea. As long as mercenary warbands are hired to fight against other mercenary warbands, there are ample opportunities for orders to be misinterpreted, misunderstood, misconstrued, or simply just forgotten, lost, or otherwise misplaced. Because who knows, perhaps the opposing side has a better offer. Or perhaps even better, the opposing side has a business proposal to come with. It is not an entirely unknown scenario for groups of mercenaries to essentially cooperate. They will chase each other around the countryside, staging mock battles where troops will be fleeing and charging in what is essentially a great staged play, making a damn good show of themselves without actually fighting a whole lot, and then withdrawing to chase each other across the countryside for a few more years. Hopefully until they have sucked the coffers dry of both their patrons. These wonderful little agreements, however, are certainly not the most common way that mercenaries will avoid fighting each other, simply because when you are trusting the other party to pretend to fight you, there's always the opportunity that someone will pay him a vast quantity of coins to drop the act. And, well, since the other party thinks that you're pretending, you've got a pretty good shot at being a little bit, original with your next play, yes? And such a lucrative play indeed. And as you might also imagine, behavior like this has led to certain attitudes of discomfort when it comes to dealing with mercenaries. For example, in Bretonnia, no truly noble family will ever be caught dead hiring foreign mercenaries. It's dishonorable, it's filthy, it's downright disgusting when you come to think of it, to hire some dirty foreign peasant with a long pointy stick to fight for you, when you have thousands of inbred morons just waiting in the local villages. And not to mention the cost. I mean, mercenaries, not only do they expect to be paid like the filthy sacks of money-grubbing whoresons they are, but occasionally they even require to be fed and equipped. Absolute nonsense. Much better to use the good old-fashioned Bretonian peasant. Not only is he required to provide his own gear, and food, and accommodations, and transport, and everything else he might need, but you don't even really have to pay him. In fact, it is his solemn duty to come and help out in times of crises. Ah, such a lovely system, is it not? Snuff, snuff, snuff. And of course, there are also a few limitations placed upon the hireability of Dogs of War warbands due to rampant racism and religious bigotry. For example, most Empire leaders will find it rather hard to stomach hiring a band of Norscan savages. Probably has something to do with the fact that a lot of these Norscan savages tend worshipping deities that encourage their followers to murder and eat their own children. A stance on religious practice that many in the Empire find ever so slightly distasteful. Although I'm sure Angela Merkel would find it downright charming and give us some spiel about how we should accept other cultures. And this is certainly something that happens in the Warhammer world to some extent. For example, the High Elves will stoop to hiring human mercenaries if they get really desperate, as well as certain factions being able to hire things that might not normally be within their purview. For example, the Empire can hire Ruglug's armoured orcs. As the name might suggest, this is a band of orc mercenaries wielding relatively heavy armour and crossbows. They are a surprisingly civilized lot, by orc standards obviously, seeing as they are capable of not only talking to humans, but also discussing the rates at which they may be hired, and this is perhaps one of the more unusual examples, since orcs would normally consider humans to be somewhat, squishy. Then again, it is remarkable just how persuasive a large bag of coins can be, even to the somewhat brutish mind of an orc. And speaking of acceptance and diversity, the Dogs of War also contain quite a few unique things. For example, there is Al-Mukhtar's Desert Dogs, the only official unit that we know of from Araby, a country that, well, we have really no idea how works. However, from what we can see from Al-Mukhtar's Desert Dogs, they certainly have a Middle Eastern influence to them. We also have a warband of lizardmen skinks riding cold ones, which is rather unusual to say the least, as well as a bunch of pirate dwarves, complete with parrots and peg legs and the whole works, and some more normal units, though quite unusual in the Warhammer world. For example, Pirazzo's Lost Legion, which is a unit of pikemen, with decidedly Spanish conquistador elements to them. These are units that don't really exist anywhere else in the usual Warhammer armies, which often make them a great addition to already existing armies. For example, an Empire army can make use of Ruglud's armoured orcs to have a nice heavy ranged unit that is capable of weathering most of what the enemy is capable of throwing at them at range, and also pretty decent melee fighters as well. Or perhaps something really unique, like the Birdmen of Katraza, which is a human mercenary warband using fancy little flying contraptions, which are essentially canvas stretched across a remarkably flimsy-looking wooden contraption that they can use to fly across the battlefield. And they happen to be armed with crossbows, which makes them a fairly effective unit, everything considered, being fast, maneuverable, and equipped with weapons that pack a fair bit of punch. And additionally, there really isn't a whole lot in the Warhammer world that is like them. And rest assured, I intend to make videos for pretty much every single one of them at some point, and considering how weird and bizarre many of them are, they really do deserve their own videos. So this has been a fairly short video by my standards, but I am in a somewhat hectic situation at the moment with a relatively jury-rigged recording system here, so it's gonna have to be a little bit more brief than what I'm normally known for. Hopefully my computer will pop up back from the shop at some point in the nebulous future. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.